Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 87. Why Identity Orchestration Matters is the topic, and our guest today is Eric Olden, co-founder and CEO of Strata Identity. Welcome, Eric.
Great to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into identity orchestration, maybe you could just share with your audience a little bit about yourself and how you came to found Strata.
Yeah, happy to. So I think if you look at my career, it's been in identity from the beginning and got involved in identity in the very early days of the web in the mid 90s with my first company, Securant. And we were solving the problem of web access management and really helping people deal with the scale of identities that came with consumer websites and things like that. That company got acquired by RSA, and then took some time off. Started my second company, Simplified, and we were really helping people at Simplified deal with the fact that identity left the building, and now it's in your SaaS applications. In 2006, it was a pretty radical idea, and we grew that business, and then coincidentally also acquired by RSA. And then I think the third chapter is really where we are today, where multi-cloud is the new problem, because now people have moved to the cloud, but they don't go to just one, they go to usually 2, 3, as many as 7. And each of those clouds has an IDP built in. And so now the problem is, how do you manage multiple IDPs? And that's really where the opportunity to create a new category called identity orchestration came about. And the way I think about what Strata is doing is building the VMware of identity and making everything that's kind of different vendors and different clouds all play nice together. So it's been a nice journey through identity, through all of those different kind of generations of identity.
And how is, you have a sort of interesting perspective because you've been at it literally forever. You started one of the first web access management companies. How have you seen it change? What's different about today? Is it just the fact that there are multiple cloud providers, or what else do you see as the difference from previous access management challenges for enterprise?
I think one of the big things is the scope and the centrality of identity has changed a lot. If you go back into the early 2000s, people were trying to do the 3 A's: authentication, access control, and audit. And now today in 2025, we think of it as 7 A's. So you start with those first 3, but now you add on to that authorization. Authorization requires attributes. And then you've got a whole administration or governance world. And then the new thing is availability. So what I've seen in identity is like a decomposition of the problem of identity into multiple components. And each of those components, you can bring a best of breed solution into that, where if you want an IDP that's really good at authorization, Glue is a great way to go. If you want to do something, you want to do an authentication specific thing, there's a lot of choices there. But the role of orchestration is to tie all of the different identity services together into what we think of as an identity fabric. So it's less about being, in our view, less about being the identity service, because there's a lot of really good choices there. And more for us is to serve our customer so that they can mix and match whatever they want to do, make a change, and not have to rewrite their entire application environment just to change the identity system that maybe they need to, for compliance reasons, roll out MFA, but they don't want to, or they can't change the target application. So the ability to do that, where you can pull things in and out of your identity fabric and have that carry through to all of your applications, that seems to be the new thing as I see it.
Do you think that identity orchestration is a new segment in the market? I always think of the segments like there's, identity management, there's identity and access governance, there's SSO. Do you think orchestration is itself a new segment in the market?
I do. In a very similar way to how VMware came about. And if you think about VMware, what they did was they created an abstraction layer that virtualized all of the components in compute. And before VMware, you had to make a lot of compromises. You use some hardware to run Linux workloads, other hardware to run Windows. You maybe had some Solaris, various pieces. It got to be really complicated. AIX if you're a IBM shop. And virtualization made that so much easier. And the idea of saying, look, don't be locked in to an operating system or a hardware platform. Today, people don't even think about that anymore. But when you go back into the early 2000s, late 90s, that was a huge problem. And so what I think of with identity orchestration, it's applying that kind of concept of an abstraction layer, but instead of virtualizing servers, we're virtualizing entire IDPs with the benefit to the customer that now they don't have to be locked into anything and they can move things around and do rationalization, consolidation, and basically save money and get more kind of best of breed things out of identity that shouldn't be that hard to implement. And now you can do it without rewriting applications.
Right. This, you might not know the answer to this. I always hate it when people ask me about other vendors' products because I say, well, I'm not that vendor. How would I know? But a product like Ping DaVinci allows you to sort of use low code to what I would consider orchestrate different sources of identity and different business logic. Do you see a tool like that sort of in your segment? And I guess, if you want to have a segment, you want enough players in that market so you have enough players to have a conference with, like, and to have things to talk about. Do you see DaVinci as sort of in your segment? Or if you don't, what are some of the other solutions? Maybe some of the new SaaSes. There's that new one, I forget their name, that are very big in the B2B space. Who do you see as some of the other players here?
Well, Ping's a good company. DaVinci was a smart acquisition by Ping to bring that capability in. I think in terms of the use case that you can use DaVinci for is really for SaaS application onboarding. So if you have a banking portal and you want to bring new accounts onto your banking portal, things like DaVinci can do that in a pretty elegant way. They're up against companies like Transmit and Dscope that
Right, Bscope was the one I was trying to think of. Thank you.
yeah, and they're great companies. But when in terms of like doing what Strata does, we don't require any dependency on the IDP at runtime. And so that means you can do things with our approach to orchestration that really reaches into your on-premises hybrid scenarios, secure your enterprise workloads, and to kind of make multiple IDPs work together. Because in those other examples, they work as long as you're using Ping as the IDP or you're using Dscope or Transmit as the IDP. Whereas Strata's approach, we're IDP agnostic. So we don't care what IDP you use. In fact, we often see there's like 3 or 4, as many as 12 different identity providers by vendor, let alone instances and all the other things that come along with that. So we're more solving the problem of complexity and mixed environments as opposed to only looking at how you can handle people using your SDK and your SaaS platform. So I think there's a huge market here, a lot of room for a lot of different players, but our focus is to be IDP agnostic and not to force anybody to use any IDP.
Uh-huh. I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job as a live streamer if I didn't ask you something about AI. When I hear about all this complexity, I'm wondering, can AI, help organizations understand these infrastructures? And do you see any other intersections with AI and identity orchestration that might make the job a little easier?
We're seeing a lot of customers come to us with the big question of how do I manage all of these new use cases where it's not a human necessarily on the other end of the transaction. So I think there's a big overlap with non-human identities. That's what we're seeing a lot, where the AIs will be, think about this like an artificial identity. So another play on the AI word, but what that means in practice is that your APIs are what your AIs are accessing, and the volume of requests and the depth at which they're able to go into your organization through these APIs probably outnumbers the humans. Maybe it's, I think, depending on what statistic you look at, it could be anywhere from 5 to 1 to 100 to 1, and it depends on your use case. But that's a huge amount of risk that people are just now kind of realizing, wait, we need to be able to govern that. We need to put controls in place so that we don't lose data or have our kind of data pulled out and taken into the AI for the learning. The other side that we see it, where Strata's employing it and making our identity orchestration platform better, is to make sense of unstructured data, and compliance is a big part of that. So being able to help organizations with recommendations and remediation so they can be more GDPR compliant and SOC 2 and things like that, where you have a huge body of compliance regulations, and it's hard to figure out what applies to your organization, what applies to your environment. And so we're using AI to kind of match the requirements and regulations that a company is subject to and map that over to their identity fabric. So it's really exciting space. Our engineers are having a great time, working on these use cases because they multiply incredibly quickly. So yeah, I think AI is here to stay. There's no question about that. It's really interesting to see when you get past the hype, and see what's real and what's going to make a difference. And that's really where I think we need to, as an industry, focus not on gimmicks, but on fundamental things like, how you secure and build that AI experience in a trustworthy, controlled way, so you don't lose your privacy in the AI world. So really keeping a control on where that data can go and how you deploy that. You got to really think about that. And so the local AIs that you can use, the models that don't run everything into the cloud, that I think is what we're seeing in banking, and we're seeing that in telecom, where that's a real concern is, hey, we got to keep the data here, but we want to use the benefit of AI and Gen AI and large language models. So how do you do that from an identity standpoint? Keep track of your data.
You said something interesting in there, just to pivot a little off the AI topic, about how being compliant is so important, SOC 2 compliant or ISO conformant, and that each of these IDPs is basically comes with a certification for SOC or ISO. Just as a personal example, we adopted Glue as our IDP primarily because we want it to make it easier to be SOC 2 conformant. We used SecureFrame. Everything was hooked up, in our compliance package through, by picking a conformant IDP. But yeah, you mentioned what you raised sort of made me aware of some new challenges. If I have multiple IDPs, each of those needs to be SOC 2 conformant. Are you seeing some of the requirements there, or is compliance or driving some of these policies, and how do you see that getting more complex when you introduce multiple IDPs?
Well, a big part of where we see that complexity happen is in multinational deployments. And to be specific, if you like Strata's customer base, they're really large enterprises and they don't run in one geography. And so oftentimes you'll have, think about a global bank. And they've got operations in Switzerland, they've got operations in the US, they've got operations in the EU and the UK. So in that example, you've got a lot of different rules that, for instance, GDPR, that stipulate how you need to treat identities in country. And so when you start to think about how you want to make all of these things work together, you've got to solve the privacy issue without violating the GDPR mandate. And what that ends up looking like is a series of IDPs that are positioned in each of those locales. And then you use federation to link them together without the data leaving the country of governance. And so it gets pretty complicated around that. Another example where we see within identity, especially on availability and resilience, is a new regulation that's taking effect in 2025 in the EU called DORA. It's called the Digital Operations Resiliency Act. And a big part of that is that, the more we move to our business becomes online, the more people are dependent on it for healthcare, for banking, for government. Well, if you have an outage on your identity system, then all of those applications are unavailable. And that's not an acceptable position to have a single point of failure. And so what we're seeing people look for is, how do I make my identity fabric redundant so that if I have an outage in one IDP, I can fail over to one that's available? And so that's an example where orchestration is meeting these new regulations, which are coming out because identity has never been more important than it is today.
I mean, it's always been sort of a dream to have the ability to authenticate, let's say, on two different IDP platforms, right? But how do you handle credentials because my credentials, I guess I have different credentials in each of these IDPs, but do you see any issues around credential management or credential sharing, and have you seen any positive impact for passkeys yet in being able to use maybe a single passkey or passkeys for both my Entra and my Okta? Is that happening at all?
It is. One thing that we're very opinionated on is the need to get people off of passwords. And, being in this industry for 30 years, I've just seen, and everyone else has seen, how many problems, how many vulnerabilities and exploits happen because of human weakness, like we're the weak link in the chain, and then the dependency on passwords. So,
i.e. phishing.
exactly.
Passwords, yeah.
So we get, first of all, how do we get rid of passwords? And the idea that you can use, whether it's passkeys, I love standard, so FIDO2 passkeys are great. Now they're becoming ubiquitous with all of the Windows or Microsoft and Apple and Google all getting behind it. So now you've got this really easy way to do multi-factor authentication. But the other part of it is when you think about failover, when you have a credential in your primary IDP, and then you're going to fail over to the secondary IDP, well, you got to be able to do that seamlessly. And so part of how we do that is using different techniques and never rely on a password, because if you end up brokering and dealing with passwords, you're just inviting trouble. And so we take a secure by design and just say, look, we're not going to touch passwords in that example. So way that you can do it, there's a couple different approaches. You can do one-time passwords, you can do magic links, and of course, I think the best one is using passkeys.
So don't sync passwords across IDPs is what you're saying.
Bad practice. Avoid it. Get rid of the passwords in the first place, and then you don't have to worry about syncing them. And the sooner people get off of passwords, the happier their users are and the better the risk profile is. So that's usually step one in all of our implementations.
Interesting perspective. Currently, each cloud provider like AWS, Google, Azure uses some proprietary identity system with its own policy language, all of which are incompatible with each other. Can you talk a little bit about how Hexa and IDQL help solve this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big believer in standards, and did a lot of work in the early days of SAML to give the ability to have identities be secure and portable. So you can have things like federation. And that really made things easy to integrate. Fast forward to 2022, I think, 2021, I guess it started. And we're looking at, well, where is the other point of lock-in? It turned out it's in the policies themselves, because people would have no idea what the policies were inside of their IDP when they needed to move it over to, a new IDP. And so we saw that as another point of lock-in. And we looked at that and said, well, what could we do to make the portability of policy between clouds work in the first place, but do it in a secure, open way? And so we started working with industry and other partners, and we came up with the identity query language, or IDQL.
Can I just pause there for 1 second? When you say that the policies are different between IDPs, could you give an example of that? Like, what kind of policies are you talking about?
Well, the most common ones that people care about for compliance are authentication policies, and then access control policies, and then administration policies. An authentication policy would define how you're going to authenticate to an application, or to get a session, or to access data. And the access control policy is like it sounds like, can you get into this application? Can you do this type of transaction? When you think about the governance or the delegated administration policies, that has to do with typically ownership. Where in the organization do these applications or these users, who's responsible for them? So those are three kinds of examples of policies for authentication, access, and administration. And what we do with IDQL is we take those from the proprietary bespoke structure, the data model in whatever IDP you have. And then we say, look, if you take a proprietary data structure that represents that policy, maybe in AWS. And
Right. So, like, are we talking about AWS IAM access rules now, about infrastructure, or are we talking about AWS Cognito, and perhaps claims that you might have in the IDP and AWS?
yes, both,
Both.
right?
Okay.
And why I say it that way is, when you're dealing with AWS, that's generally known as the place that you're going to run your workloads, your applications. And they also, Amazon offers an IDP like Cognito and Amazon Identity, but a lot of customers will use a product like, maybe it's Okta for some use cases. So you're not necessarily going to get all of the policy for authentication in one system. You may have to merge more than one system together, right? And so policy is actually can be spread into more than one IDP or cloud provider. So part of it is to kind of make all of these things work together, right? Where you don't have that fragmentation. So yeah, the policies are really, they're everywhere. And the key is to take it out of the proprietary structure, make it into something that's interoperable, like a Rosetta Stone, and that you can then take it from one native format, convert it to a generic format, and then reconvert it to a different proprietary format. And that's the role of the Hexa open source software that we brought to market, is to do the policy transformation. So we kind of make that as a free open source tool so that our customers and the industry at large, they can move from one cloud to another without having to re-engineer their roles and their access policies, and just say, hey, I got it working in the first place. Now I need to replicate it over in a different place, and I need to do it at scale, because often you're talking about thousands and thousands of policies, and that's something you need software to do. So that was the role of Hexa, is to be the way to transform these policies from any format into any other format.
So for example, if you had OPA policies, could you translate them to Cedar policies for Amazon AVP, for example? Would that be an example?
Yeah, exactly. So in that to be specific, you could take a Rego policy, which is what OPA uses, and you can then make it work with Cedar policy language. And the Hexa tool does both of those natively. So it'll represent in Cedar using IDQL. So to basically, if you want to learn one language or one design, do IDQL, because that is able to consume and interoperate with all of those different ones that you mentioned.
I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this, Eric, but so I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. But a lot of these IDPs, of course, after an authentication happens, they mint some kind of token. And those tokens might have custom claims. Do you see something like Hexa, or not Hexa, something like Strata, helping to figure out like what are the rules associated with these various tokens? Like, how do you does Strata help you make sense of all the tokens that are being minted by these various IDPs?
Yeah, we do. We're in the business around the non-human identity, where you're typically the machine-to-machine use cases are all token-based. And the one that we are big believers in, our customers are asking us for, is OAuth and OIDC. And so that's a nice standard to make the things interoperable, but it doesn't do anything just to have a standard from a governance standpoint. And so a lot of what we do is make that easy to do token minting or token transformation. And I think the token transformation in the sessions, that's something that all of Strata's customers really like about the platform, because sure, there's OAuth tokens and OIDC today,
Mm-hmm.
but you have a long string of tokens in the past, going all the way back to the cookie days and the Kerberos days, right? And so to convert from NTLM, like we've got customers who still use that.
Yeah.
It's not secure, but what you can do is you can take NTLM and you can add more trust to it and kind of solve problems, not by necessarily getting rid of NTLM, but by making it more secure, by putting better guardrails, auditing, attaching multi-factor authentication to the generation and creation of those tokens. So from a Strata standpoint, we're token agnostic, right? We do a lot of transforming one into the other. And in the end, that's really about interoperability and breaking lock-in. So bring your tokens, we'll make new ones, we'll change your old ones into new ones, and new ones into other different formats. So yeah, it's a pretty active part of the market right now.
So does the Strata infrastructure basically, is it like an Uber token service where it actually accepts tokens from various IDPs and then mints an Uber token that's controlled by the domain and that has all the transformations and enrichments, but you actually are minting new tokens to be trusted by internal enterprise applications?
Yeah, that's part of it. And when you think about it from an orchestration standpoint, what goes into the token from an attributes perspective, you need to source trustworthy attributes. Sometimes those are going to come from a directory. Other times they'll come from a signal provider. Sometimes they're going to come from a SAML assertion, right? So the ability to decompose, say, a SAML session and say, hey, what are the attributes about this user coming from a third-party site that I need to do an authorization decision on? Well, you're going to unpack the SAML, you're going to take the attributes out, and then you're going to reconstitute a new, maybe it's a JOT token is what your ultimate consumption is. Well, what goes into that, it's almost like you need a bill of materials for where that data came from. What is the provenance of that? And if you can't show the chain of custody, if you will, to say that this is a trustworthy set of attributes, then that becomes a vehicle to do spoofing, and you put whatever attributes you want in there. So it's a lot of it has to do with how you source attributes, how you vet and you verify the string of the chain of custody, so that those have not been manipulated on their way to the downstream application. So a lot of work goes into these tokens, as you know, right? It's I think the world, the token it's one of the hardest working pieces of identity. And a lot of times people don't appreciate how critical it is to design your session tokens in a way that is not going to create more problems than you think it's going to solve.
So would it be, just to give a concrete example of this, maybe you're looking at a bunch of tokens, and one of the tokens is from Google, and it asserts the email address, and another token's from Microsoft, and it asserts some Microsoft group memberships, let's say. And you're saying that you need something sort of in the middle to say, well, I trust this attribute, but not from this token, but not this attribute, and some way to transform or maybe even call APIs to enrich and say, based upon this information I have, maybe I should even add this extra information. Does that sound fair or accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. And then think about a specific use case that we see pretty regularly is when you're doing authorization on a transaction. And if you have a certain dollar amount where the threshold is you're going to sell something like a digital good, maybe it's $5. And, so if it went wrong, you're only going to be out $5. On the other hand, if you're going to be doing big banking transactions where you can't afford to be wrong, then you need to really think, how do we make sure that all of these tokens are going to be trustworthy, and you're going to want to be able to add to it. So mint it in the first place, but then enrich it. And so as you get higher risk or more valuable transactions, you can decorate that token with more attributes that maybe come from a fraud system that someone uses to identify suspicious transactions or bots, and to be able to verify this is a trusted identity that's creating this transaction, because we can do the chain of custody all the way to where the token was originally minted. So it gets kind of complicated, but in the end, it's really about finding how many attributes and which attributes do you need to get that level of confidence and trust. And that's usually changes from company to company and often transaction to transaction.
It sounds like Strata itself needs its own set of policies to govern these rules. Um, how do you actually allow customers to express and externalize those policies?
With IDQL, we kind of use our own standard. So it's a declarative model, so it's really easy, human readable. And then we provide APIs for people to go and do that programmatically. So it's nice when you can simplify something that gets really complicated. And we find that by using a real simple, easy to understand policy definition, then you avoid making mistakes because you don't really understand, what's going on. So that was the first thing. Make it real simple, make it human readable, make it something that we can create. And we haven't done this yet, but imagine someone could put it into the blockchain so it's immutable, right? And say, this is the policy and this is where we made the decision and why. So there are a lot of different things.
Mint an NFT. No, but so just to make it a little more concrete, so you're saying that the interface, you're going to define your policies in IDQL and Strata, and then perhaps connect an implementation like Amazon Verified Permissions or AVP, which will actually hold the policies. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then you can, depending on how you do your implementation, you can call the AVP framework and hand it some attributes, and it'll give you back an answer. So that's our approach, is to use the open request response model. AVP is one option. OPA is another. There's a lot of different innovation that's going on there. But the idea is that when you orchestrate, you're bringing together different systems, right? Bring together an authorization system together with an attribute provider, and then be able to hand the attributes to the authorization system And then when you get a response of, are we going to allow or deny that transaction, then the orchestrator can then do the next step in the process, right? So it's all part and parcel of how the systems work. And it's really about moving transactions across a distributed ecosystem.
I'm curious. Hexa is open source. It says CNCF incubating or sandbox project. Um,
Mhm.
how's it going? Like, is there a community developing around it? And what was some of the business reason? This must be non-differentiating architecture for you or software for you, where you felt like there was no competitive advantage. Like, why'd you open source it? And how's it going with the community? And was it worth it?
Yeah, well, I believe it's absolutely worth it for a couple of reasons. One is philosophical, right? I'm a staunch believer in standards and making things open, right? If you have a great product, you can make it better
But Stratus
if
not open
everyone,
source.
no, but SAML was, right? And first you have to come up with a standard, and then you have reference implementation. So going back to the early SAML days, we had, to wait a long time before you could have SAML in all these different places. And it's like the fax machine problem. If you remember my early days of SAML,
Unfortunately, I do
a
remember
lot of
fax machines.
yeah, and remember early on we were like, oh, this is great. But like the fax machine problem is, if I have a fax machine, but I'm the only person who can use it, then it's worth zero, because I need you to have
Yeah, you need a
your own
network
fax machine.
effects. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can share. So what we did with IDQL is we said, look, not only are we going to give the protocol and the definition, but we're going to give out free fax machines. And that's where Hexa comes in. So the reason we made it open source is to make the adoption of it super easy. And then on top of that, Hexa has everything you need to talk to all of the major cloud platforms, right? It works out of the box with Azure, with Amazon, with Google, and some of the API gateways. So that's kind of like take a free fax machine, and it's already integrated with all the major systems that you're going to want to connect it to in the first place. So the hope with that, Mike, has been to spur adoption, where people didn't have to wait for someone to build the endpoint that's going to work with whatever cloud provider they have. And so we've been really happy with the adoption and the speed at which it's happened. So in 2 years, we've been able to get so many of the integration points done with this model. So now today, this afternoon, you can download Hexa and start to synchronize and move policies from all the major cloud platforms, and do that in about an hour. So I think that's going pretty well.
Nice. So get out your crystal ball. um, and how do you see identity orchestration helping enterprises future-proof, like what's coming? Like there's all that we know that there's all these new demands coming, agents, AI agents acting on people's behalf, future acquisitions. Where do you think, how does identity orchestration help enterprises better position themselves for the future?
I think the single biggest thing is the abstraction layer. And the abstraction layer is the way that we surface this idea of an identity fabric. So you take the abstract concept of, hey, I've got a whole series of different IDPs that I need to deal with, but I don't want to deal with them individually. I want to deal with them more consistently. And that is where I'm a big believer in fabrics, and the idea being, hey, how do you manage a lot of different things in a way that is predictable and you can make it repeatable without custom code? So that was a big part of future proofing, is by putting that abstraction layer in there, and kind of follow the approach that VMware did. Once you say, hey, I want to future proof my compute, well, get out of the lock-in to your hardware, and then you end up with cloud computing. People don't talk about hardware in the cloud anymore, right? You have, like, I grew up, I think we talked about this before, used to matter a lot which hardware that you went with. And now people don't talk about that, right? Here in Silicon Valley, you look at all the tech companies on Highway 101, and they're different. And no longer do you see Sun, which was one of the biggest, one of my favorites. They're gone. One of the most powerful and successful hardware companies is irrelevant. Why? Because people don't want hardware. There are some people who are moving stuff back on-prem, and I think there's always going to be an exception that proves the rule. And often with now this data with AI models, they do want to have
They
hardware.
still build their own clouds.
Yeah, and there's hardware is what runs your cloud. So I'm not saying hardware is dead, but with the abstraction layer that virtualization gave us, it matters a whole lot less which vendor you use. And in the early 2000s, VMware was far from a sure thing, right? People had a whole idea that, oh, it's never going to scale. It's only good for test and dev use cases on laptops or developers. Well, once it made its way with ESX and it made it onto the server, that changed everything. And then all of a sudden, people really en masse understood that. Identity orchestration is going through a similar trajectory where people are initially, hey, I've never heard of this. This is a new concept. And then they start to play with the technology and they realize, we do have multiple IDPs. We do have all these different things. You mean I can make them play well together, even if they're two competitive vendors? And then you realize that's the power of a fabric, is it just makes everything consistent. So that's where we're excited to see where the industry is going. It's kind of, what is the saying? The past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So that's we're not trying to replicate virtualization, but we're seeing a lot of similar concepts and benefits with identity orchestration and identity fabrics, as you saw with server virtualization.
I think we attended a Digital Identity World, and I saw you when you were handing out books of this on utility computing. Do you remember that?
I do. Nicholas Carr.
Exactly. You just reminded me of that. That must have been 2007 or 2008 when the idea of utility computing was still new. Is that where we're at? We're in utility computing of identity at this point? And let's go to last thoughts.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts before we break?
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's where utilities have come. And you think about that centralized model, become more and more capable IDPs. And you look at what like Microsoft has done with Entra. They put everything in the kitchen sink in there. So everything from your classic single sign-on, you put some governance on there, and you have the end-to-end solution, kind of a monolith. It's in a way, we're going back to the monolith in some ways. What orchestration can do is to say, hey, you can have a monolith, but maybe you want to use a different part of another IDP. So I like the authentication of this one. The performance of that one is good for authorization, but I need to link the two of them together. And that's really where identity orchestration is great at linking things together so that you can do whatever use case that you want using the technology and the vendor that you like. And so I think where the market's going is more and more AI is going to be driving more and more non-human identity use cases. You're going to need to get really good at how you handle tokens and get really good at how you manage things as they move from one platform to the other, and make sure that you don't trade off trust and security for convenience. And I'll leave you with the last thought is get rid of those passwords. The sooner you do it, the better it's going to be.
Awesome. Okay, Eric. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Quick reminder to the audience, please go to LinkedIn and hit follow on a Generati Office Hours company page, and you'll get annoying spam every time we have a new event, which is twice a week. So thanks, audience. Thanks again, Eric. And we'll see you, I guess, next Tuesday for a deep dive on Auth-C with a new vendor in the space. So.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Enjoy.